And now, stand-up community subscribers and listeners from around the globe, it's time to Stand Up with Pete Dominic, where we ask the important questions that impact you, your family, and your community. Such as, does it mean I failed at life if my deepest regret doesn't involve strategically placed porcupines? And will the Build Back Better plan be signed into law someday soon because Daddy needs his meds? And now the podcast host who is on the cusp of another apex model breakthrough, Pete Dominic.
Yes, thank you very much, Pete Co. That is right. Always ripping openings and references from my actual life headlines. Yesterday, I shared a text that I received where a modeling company reached out to me, asked me if I wanted to do some modeling. Apparently, however, my 14-year-old daughter reached out to this agency and gave them my number. So that's really what happened. But I had a lot of fun with that guy, nonetheless. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Stand Up. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for all the feedback you're giving me on the program. I asked for feedback on the opening of the show, and it just keeps coming, and that means people are constantly listening every day, and I love it. Overwhelmingly positive for keeping this big, robust, comprehensive news segment. So thank you very much. You want to share any idea with me, any criticism, any comment, any error in editing, anything, standupwithpete@gmail.com. Standupwithpete.com is the website. If you're not already a stand-up member, please sign up and join us. We'd love to have you be a part of our community and hang out with us on Thursday nights. And soon we will all get together somewhere, somehow, in many places, maybe even. Awesome. Two guests joining me today. Two very different discussions. One is kind of a policy discussion about criminal justice, and the other one is a conversation with legendary comedy writer Chris Regan, who I worked with a million years ago, and I follow on Twitter, and I said, hey, man, can I interview you? And it was great. So, but first, I am not doing the news today, actually, here on the Wednesday show, because Tuesday night, and well, most of the second half of Tuesday, really, I was in New York City helping support and host an event for the Great Why Hunger organization, nonprofit dedicated to ending hunger worldwide. They do amazing work. I've been working with them for several years, and I hosted their event in New York City, which was a real smash. It was a real success. A lot of fun, a lot of excitement, but I got home just now, like 11 o'clock at night, and so there's just no time to put a news segment together that it takes quite a few hours every day, and happy to do it, but I'd like to do a good job. So I've got my guest interviews coming up. No news. We'll get back to it tomorrow here on the show. Also, thank you to my sponsor. Yeah, electric toothbrush for you. Quip. Get Quip. .com/standup. If you don't have an electric toothbrush, you're thinking about getting one, get Quip right now. The Quip electric toothbrush is the best. 7 million mouths say so. And I have terrible oral hygiene, and I don't brush for long enough, and this thing is awesome. So definitely check it out. Get Quip.com/standup right now. And let's get to my guests. How about that? Okay, so first, I'm very excited to bring you a new guest. Both guests are new guests, never have been on the show before. And my first guest is a legal professor at the University of North Carolina who has a very important and interesting new book out called Punishment Without Trial: Why Plea Bargaining is a Bad Deal. She's a criminal law professor at University of North Carolina. She is also director of the Prosecutors in Politics Project and the author of this new book, which I hope that you will get. You can find her on Twitter at CB Hessick, Hessick. And we had a great conversation. This is about criminal justice. The book is just out on sale this week, and I was really excited to meet her and talk to her. I learned a lot, and her phone went out just a tiny bit a couple times, but mostly, I think, great audio. So without further ado, let's introduce you to an amazing, important professor talking about a very important issue about plea bargaining. Let's do it.
I love it.
All right, I'm ready.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it.
Cool. All right, here we go. All right, I've got her now, and I'm very excited to have her to talk to her about her expertise and, most importantly, her book, which is out now this week, Punishment Without Trial, Why Plea Bargaining is a Bad Deal. Professor Hessick, congratulations. Thank you for joining us here, and I'm excited to be in your podcast virtual classroom, I guess. I don't know.
No, I'm super excited to talk to you. Thanks so much for having me on.
So I want to just a little bit, let's talk about you and your credentials and what you do and why you do it before we get to the subject of your book, if we can now. I don't want to brag, but I've interviewed a lot of high-profile legal professors and lawyers, and often they are the distinguished professor named after a person. And I'm wondering if, like in the intro, like how important is the chair that you hold, the person that it's named after? Should I be reading that in the intro? The Ransdell Distinguished Professor of Law at UNC?
Oh, if you could say something about the Ransdells, that would be lovely. The chair is actually named after two people. Buck Ransdell, who was a prosecutor here in North Carolina, and his wife, Anne, they met in law school. And after Buck passed away, Anne decided to endow the chair. I'm the first person who has it. And I have sort of a soft spot in my heart for this. My husband and I also met in law school. Law school can be a little bit like junior high, and that you're up in everybody's business. They give you a locker. And so I love their story. I love that they did it. And I teach criminal law, and I research about the criminal justice system. So that the thought that I have a chair that's named after a really well-respected local prosecutor means a lot to me.
Oh, that's a nice story. Now, where did your husband end up? Did he do well as well? Is he a professor? Is he a lawyer?
Yeah, no, he's just down the hall. He teaches civil procedure and administrative law and federal jurisdiction. He teaches a bunch of stuff. We write some articles together sometimes. It's fun. It's fun.
That sounds romantic. What is your conversation like at dinner? Is it all legal stuff? Like, would a person who is not an expert, who is spying on your conversation about legal stuff, would that be interesting to us? And who wins those arguments? Good Lord.
It's a mixture of, like who has to drive the kids to what appointment. And then, so-and-so had a new article, or did you see that the Supreme Court just granted cert in a case? It's varying degrees of weird and completely normal.
So, but again, you guys are like, oh, I love when you talk about jurisprudence. It really gets me fired up. That's not a thing. Okay, so I'm very excited to talk to you about such an important issue, which you have been writing about and covering for a long time. Tell me a little bit about how you became interested in, can I just say criminal justice?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So, you go to law school and you think different classes are interesting. I thought my criminal law class was really interesting. And when I was out in the world and working for a judge, as a lot of young lawyers do when they first get out of law school, the Supreme Court decided a big case about criminal sentencing, and it sort of threw the country into disarray. The federal prosecutors called my judge's chambers, and they postponed every single sentencing. And it was an exciting time to see all of that happen. And so it looked as though American sentencing was going to be radically transformed. And so I, took a fellowship saying I wanted to become a law professor and write about criminal sentencing. But pretty soon, everything sort of got back to normal. There wasn't, I think, the revolution that everyone thought there was going to be. And that was in part because so much of what happens at sentencing actually depends on what prosecutors do. What sort of charges do they bring? And then what sort of plea bargains that they offer. So after a bunch of years of researching criminal sentencing, I started spending a lot more time looking at prosecutors, what happens in their elections, the power that they have, both to sort of bring charges, but then also to not bring charges, which is an important power that a lot of people don't know about. And when I would talk to my friends and family who aren't lawyers, they didn't really understand the way the system is currently set up. I mean, they'd watch movies and TV where they'd see all of these criminal trials. And I thought it was important to explain to people that the way they think the criminal justice system works isn't what happens in reality.
Yeah, and you're really good at that. And this book goes a long way. at doing that as well. What was the decision? Do you mind just going back to that moment when you were working for that judge? Like, what was the sentencing decision? And it sounds like the way you described it from the context, it was a good thing. It was something, a reform that many people, experts, advocates have been fighting for. What was that? What happened?
Oh, yeah. No, so the case was called Blakely versus Washington. And what had been happening was, Congress and lawmakers in the states had built up all of these rules they set to limit how much power judges had at sentencing. And what it meant was basically that people could get really, really long sentences, even though the facts that were being used to decide what sentences they got weren't being sent to a jury. And the Supreme Court said, we think that violates the Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial. Interesting decision written by Justice Scalia, joined by a bunch of the liberal justices and Justice Thomas. I know you spend a lot of time talking to other law professors who talk to you about the politics of the Supreme Court. When it comes to criminal justice issues, those politics can be a bit scrambled. You have a Justice Thomas or now a Justice Gorsuch, and they take very sort of strict formalistic views of the Constitution that sometimes lead them to vote in favor of criminal defense rights. That doesn't happen all the time. I mean, like Justice Alito is not going to vote in favor.
No,
of
but I know you're saying that in terms of the Supreme Court, they come down typically often in liberal or conservative, traditional liberal and conservative lines. But when it comes to criminal justice, that is, I think you said scramble. That's not always the case, which I think is super important. And I wonder if because I did want to slip this question in and you just gave me an opportunity here just to talk a little bit about criminal justice and crime and kind of the philosophy of it all, because it would seem that certain justices, certain courts and cultures even have different ideas on what justice looks like, what punishment looks like, what consequences look like. And I know you talk a lot about this from a legal standpoint, but of course, it matters how different people think about what's going to change, what's going to make us safer, redemption, forgiveness. There's a lot there. And so the question is, aren't there a lot of different points of view on what makes a community safer and what justice looks like, from the death penalty to job opportunities to other rights? Isn't that a huge and important conversation to discuss to get some agreement on before we get to some of the guts of what you're an expert on?
Yeah, so let me agree with you that I think everybody on some level cares about crime and justice. First of all, I think we all want to be safe. Like, no one wants to be the victim of a crime. But I think that there's a lot of difference of opinion about how to best make people safe.
Yes.
So some people think the best way to make people safe is to make sure that poor communities have enough opportunities for the people who live there. And other people think the best way to make people safe is to lock people up in jail for a really long period of time. And unfortunately, on some level, those are sort of factual disagreements. And it's really there's a lot of research that has gone into what reduces crime and what causes crime to increase. And I wouldn't say that we have no answers, but I'd say we have far fewer answers than you might expect. So that's one thing. But then I also think that, people disagree about what principles they think are most important. Like, if, some folks on the left side of the spectrum, they think that it's incredibly, incredibly important to make sure that whenever the government acts, it does so in a way that doesn't disadvantage people who are poor or people in communities of color. I think folks on the right, they also have principles that would suggest we need criminal justice reform. A lot of them spend a lot of time talking about liberty and about reducing the role of government in their lives. And I mean, there's not much else out there besides the criminal justice system that really interferes with people's liberty. Like, we tell people what they're not allowed to do, and then if they do it anyways, we put them in jail. So it can be like there can be sort of like a real battle and real important disagreements about things. It's one of the reasons that I love teaching criminal law to my first year students. They come in with really passionately held beliefs about crime and punishment, and then it's my job to make them think that things are a little bit more complicated than they thought when they first came in.
Yes, which is why it's so great to have the opportunity to get a discussion have a discussion with you despite not being in your UNC classroom because, I consider myself, and I think the audience does, a student of yours on these discussions. And that was so well said and super appreciated. I'm glad I finally got to the question there. I know it took me a long time to land that plane, but I think it's really important. And it would seem, as far as I can tell, I talk to a lot of experts. I read all these books about criminal justice. I have very little personal experience other than being arrested for bashing a mailbox in high school.
Oh,
yeah. But I just had to do some community service, and then we replaced the mailboxes. And my dad was really ashamed, still is. But the point is, I think that the only consensus amongst criminal justice experts is what you said. There really isn't a consensus on how to answer the most important question, make people safer in their communities. Crime has a lot. The consensus is that there is no consensus on how to stop it, how to prevent it, how to change it. A lot of different ideas, and right? That.
Yeah, so there's consensus that we don't have a good grasp on how exactly to keep people safe. But then I also think that there's consensus that what we're doing right now doesn't work very well.
Right. Okay.
We often fail to catch people who've committed crimes. Like the clearance rate, it's called, is incredibly low. Like most crimes go unsolved. But then when we do find people, we're maybe too good at locking them up for too long. So I think that there's consensus both that we haven't really figured out how to keep people safe, but also consensus that once we do sort of try to deal with things in the criminal justice system, we're not doing a very good job.
Yeah, which is exactly what your book is about. Punishment without trial, why plea bargaining is a bad deal. Such an important subject, really great and important book, getting a lot of attention from folks in your world of criminal justice, much less just legal scholars. And would it be like, do you mind giving away a little bit of chapter 1 and telling us about Damian Mills to tease the listener into getting the rest of the book?
Oh, I'd love to. So Damian's story is, I think, sort of everyone's nightmare. Damian and his friends were accused of a murder that they didn't commit. And they were pressured into pleading guilty to this murder. This is a case in Western North Carolina, out close to the mountains. And a gentleman got murdered in his home. The local law enforcement officers had a couple of tips, and they ended up inappropriately excluding one tip about the person who actually committed the murder because they erroneously thought that person was in jail. And so they had these two tips and they thought the first one must be wrong. So they really ran down the second tip, pressuring these gentlemen, including a 16-year-old boy, to say that they'd been involved. Damian held out for quite a while, but when it became clear that all of his friends had been confessing and his lawyer pressured him to plead guilty, he agreed to plead guilty, and he spent more than a decade in prison. He's since then been exonerated. They found DNA evidence linking this other group to the crime. My Governor Roy Cooper, recently pardoned Damian and his friends so that he no longer has the murder conviction, but doesn't take away the fact that he spent more than a decade in prison. And we have a lot of reason to think that there are more Damians out there, people who come into a system that's basically been redesigned to be very efficient at convicting people and creating a lot of pressure on them to plead guilty. And we shouldn't be surprised that it's working.
Who puts the pressure? Where does the pressure come from? What is the pressure for? Is it about punishment? Is it about efficiency? Is it about politics? Is it about helping your own career, climbing the ladder as a prosecutor? What is the interest in it?
Yeah, so it depends on the case. So a case like Damian's, sure. He pleaded guilty because if he'd gone to trial, he was afraid he was going to lose, and he would have spent much, much, much longer in prison than 10 years, right? For all he knew, they could have decided to seek the death penalty. So from his perspective, he was cutting his losses, right? He was hedging his bets. In other cases where the sentences after trial aren't as extreme, like people who get arrested. So I'm imagining, for example, when you got arrested for smashing up the mailboxes.
Yes.
You could do something like do community service, and they might even agree that you wouldn't even have to plead guilty, right? They'd divert you into doing a program. And then once you completed the program and said that you did it, then they would, expunge the conviction. Or for some people, it's that, they ultimately are just going to have to spend, a month in jail, but they're being held before trial. They can't pay their bail, so they're just sitting in jail. So they might as well plead guilty and get out early because the prosecutor will offer them time served. So it would be illogical for that person to spend the months in jail waiting for a trial date when they could cut their losses and go home. And even people who don't get held in jail before their trial, they have to keep coming back to the courthouse again and again and again, taking off from work, paying for parking, losing their wages to come back to resolve these cases again and again. I tell another story in the book.
Hold on 1 second. I think something happened. Just, I think you moved your phone away from your mouth. You all of a sudden sounded like you went underwater for like 10 seconds, but it's fine. Well, let me and since I interrupted, you were going to continue there, but I think it's important to talk about that. You've written a lot about and discussed a lot about the January 6th defendants, and this is a good situation to illustrate what you're saying in terms of a whole bunch. We all saw the crime being committed. We all saw that there were hundreds of people, and they all did and will be accused of different types of levels of crimes. And you wrote, I think that case illustrates this, but I don't know if you want to talk about that or if you want to finish where I interrupted you there, because you were making that point.
No. One thing about the January 6 cases that I think is really helpful is because so many people are paying attention to them.
Yeah.
I think non-lawyers are getting a glimpse into how plea bargaining works. They see the government charging people who stormed the Capitol with lots of crimes, including felonies, and then they allowed them to plead guilty to a single misdemeanor count. And I think some members of the public are saying, oh, that's terrible. Why are they getting this sort of lenient treatment? And the answer is, that's what the government does pretty often. They'll bring a whole bunch of very serious charges to pressure someone into pleading guilty to a less serious crime. That's the system that we've set up. And prosecutors and lawmakers and judges even, it's not even a secret. I was going to say they're in on the secret, but it's not a secret. They say very sort of loudly, this is how we've built our criminal justice system. We give this giant sledgehammer to prosecutors to threaten people with. And then the person would have to be literally irrational to say, oh, I stormed the Capitol on January 6th. You're offering me a deal where I'm on probation, or I can risk going to trial and getting a felony conviction where I'll probably end up spending a bunch of time in jail, if not prison. So the fact that this is all out in the open and that judges are asking the questions so that prosecutors are answering them and the media is covering this, I'm hoping that what it'll do is it'll alert the general public to the fact that this is actually how we deal with most cases in this country. It's not that the January 6th defendants are getting special treatment. They're getting sort of the usual treatment.
Well, I think it's also worth just discussing for a moment the difference between maybe those people that raided the Capitol that day, who apparently were mostly middle upper class, to me, middle upper class hitting the mailbox, to folks who are living in deep poverty or just don't have many resources or networks, in terms of how the issue of plea bargaining affects someone with more resources, more money, and someone with less. Those are the kind of two Americas, or maybe 10 Americas. Can we talk about just how that matters?
Sure. I mean, I hope what people can see is even upper middle class people, when they're sucked into the system, they're probably going to take a plea bargain. That's what the January 6th defendants are doing. They might end up getting a better deal because their lawyers have more time to negotiate on their behalf. But that's what plea bargaining is. It's a bargaining between the prosecution and the defense. So it's not about your lawyer making an impassioned plea to the jury. It's about your defense attorney having a good relationship with the prosecutor and being able to say things like, well, we might file this motion, or you need to give us, copies of these videos. And when they do those sorts of things, that's what can end up getting their clients a better deal. But the plea bargaining system that we've set up, it doesn't let upper middle class people off the hook. It just it gets them a better deal, but still ends up in a plea bargain.
Let me just try this one. I mean, you're getting a better defense attorney if you've got more money, and more importantly, it would seem that when it comes to criminal justice reform, the conversation it often is like, how did you enter the system? What was your first arrest or crime? Because the difference between people with resources and people without, and maybe I'm making this too binary, and if I'm wrong, just please tell me, because I have no idea what I'm talking about. But is that entrance into the system is part of the big problem, because with people with more resources can get out, like the January 6th insurrectionists or me. Like I was able to, take advantage of other opportunities, get a good lawyer, etc.
Oh, there's no doubt that people with more resources are going to do better in this system, right? They are going to be able to pay bail, to be released before bail. They aren't going to necessarily be in neighborhoods where they would have had a lot of interaction with police.
Good point. Yeah.
If you've already got an arrest or two on your record, they're more likely to keep you in jail before trial. They're also less likely to give you a good deal. They'll say like, oh, the prosecutor will look at your record and make a decision about how they're going to treat you. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that plea bargaining just sort of like reinforces the inequality of the system we already have. But even people with resources are going to find themselves facing the same sort of pressure that prosecutors have. They might have more resources to deal with that pressure. But I tell a story in the book about really well-off white-collar defendant. He pleaded guilty and he still believes that he's innocent. And his lawyer was telling him, look, this is a business decision. You can't let your emotions get in the way.
Right. Yeah, you have a great chapter about that as well. What are the costs for the current system of plea bargaining? How is it a bad deal for individuals, which we talked a little bit about, but more importantly, for communities, for governments? What are the costs of the system right now?
Sure. So let's put to one side the innocent people who plead guilty. Let's just talk about cases where people who did commit a crime did plead guilty for it. Why should we not want that system? Well, for one thing, we don't have a good, clear sense of what those defendants did, right? If you're allowed to plea bargain from a very serious charge to a less serious charge, then the record keeping that we have about what crimes people have committed, we can't rely on it. We know it's untrustworthy. So that's one problem. It's also a problem for victims, right? If you or your family member was the victim of a serious crime, and then you find out that the prosecutor has offered that person a plea deal to a crime that's much less serious, or really doesn't accurately reflect the harm that they caused, that can be incredibly difficult for victims to deal with.
Right.
But it's also a problem that we, just ordinary American citizens, aren't sitting on juries and paying attention to what our prosecutors are doing. Most of us, we live in states where we elect our local prosecutors. And so we're supposed to go to the ballot box every 4 or so years and choose who's going to make the important decisions about charging and plea bargaining. But the truth is, if all of this stuff is being done behind closed doors, we don't have enough information to make an informed choice. Even me, right? Like, I study prosecutors. I had to look around to find out the name of my local prosecutor, and I can't find, it's not like he posts his plea bargaining policies on a website somewhere. It's really hard to know what decisions that they're making, and we're the ones who are supposed to hold them accountable for those decisions.
Yeah, and so, the journalism on that would probably be mostly sensational. I mean, there is a huge obsession, obviously, with real crime, true crime stuff, but it's probably less on the legal end. Although, so the journalism, and then you mentioned, movies and TV shows, they sensationalize things, and they take often the exception, and they don't really get into the nitty gritty that, of course, a professor like you writing a book like this does, which helps people understand. Because that's why this book is so important. That's why your work is so important, because people need to know what is happening. This is what's happening. And lucky for you if you don't get caught up on it. And I think that's the other thing. Most people don't get caught up in it. And so they don't care about the people, which is in the millions and millions, that do, right?
That's right. I think that's something that's just really unfortunate. I think more people are starting to understand and to appreciate exactly how little this system resembles what we're taught happens in school, right?
Yeah, right.
we say things like innocent until proven guilty, but that's not actually how we treat people. Or we see our politicians go on the news and they say, this crime is so bad, we should have a mandatory minimum of 10 years in prison for anyone who does this. And then the same officials are turning around and saying, oh, the going rate for this crime is 3 years. I mean, you shouldn't lie to the public about what laws you need or why you need them.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point because what we're taught about how the criminal justice system works is not how the criminal justice system works, period. And so let me just ask you then here at the end, about the way forward, possibilities for change, reforms. I mean, there's so much that we didn't cover, which is why everybody needs to buy the book, Punishment Without Trial, Why Plea Bargaining is a Bad Deal. Professor Carissa Hessick, that's my last question to you. What does, a better system and future look like, ideally?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish that there were a simple answer. But The truth is, the problems created by plea bargaining, there are lots of them and they're complex. And it's going to take a lot of pretty sort of mundane looking changes, I think, to set up a system where people can insist on their right to trial and maybe we rein in some of the worst excesses. I don't think we'll ever get rid of plea bargaining. It's too easy. It's too attractive for judges who want to, process more cases through their courtroom, and prosecutors who don't want to lose at trial, and even defendants who can get a better deal by pleading guilty because they can get charges reduced or they can get a sentencing reduction. So I don't think we can get rid of it.
Right.
I think what we can try to do is make it a little bit more fair and a little bit more visible to the rest of us, so we can sort of make sure that the worst abuses don't happen.
Such a great book. So great to meet you as a result of it. Congratulations. It could not have been easy. I know you've got kids, but this is another kid, right? This book?
Yeah, unfortunately, I carried this one around a lot longer than 9 months, but yeah.
Thank you so much for talking to me, Professor Hessick. Great to talk to you, and I hope everybody gets the book, and I hope we get to talk to you again, because we barely scratched the surface.
It was so good to talk to you, Pete. Thanks so much. Those were some excellent questions.
Thank you. Okay, there you go. Get the book, Punishment Without Trial, right now, and at least, just go on Twitter and say hi to Carissa, Professor Hessick, at CB Hessick, and tell her you heard her here on Stand Up. That always means a lot. I always ask you to do it. I appreciate when you do. Okay, so now it's time to get to my second guest, which is a much different conversation. That was a conversation with a legal professor about a policy, specifically dealing with criminal justice, and that's, of course, plea bargaining. And now it's a wider-ranging conversation about comedy and life and politics and working with George Lopez and William Shatner and Jon Stewart and so much more, because comedy writer Chris Regan has really done it all. He's won a ton of Emmys. He was at The Daily Show for several years at the beginning, from, I think, 99 to 2006. I met him briefly there. But then later on, we worked on a show with the late great comedian Greg Giraldo, which was an awesome experience. He's worked in between with so many other greats, including Spike Fairstein, who I absolutely love. And we talk about him ghostwriting a book with William Shatner, which he has a great story about. He worked with George Lopez, which he also talks about. And he's got a lot of interesting thoughts and views on the world and politics. And he's a great guy and real funny, and I love talking to him. Ladies and gentlemen, very excited to bring you my conversation for the first time on Stand Up. Comedy writer who's now on staff, I should say, at The Family Guy. How about that? I didn't even mention that. He's been there for a while, and I'm super psyched to have caught up with him and got him on the show. And look him up on Twitter at Chris R. Regan. Chris R. Regan, and here we go.
Had the protocol in place, so I just now drive to Burbank. And this is only the second time I'm using this mic.
Oh, wow. Well, it sounds great. I'm psyched to have you. And just before we get started, I've always been a big fan of yours, and Twitter has kept me more personally connected to you and your thoughts on things and jokes. And there's just several, comedy writers who I've known and worked a little bit with, meaning I was on the show staff with them. And you did work on Greg Giraldo's show. I
did, yeah.
And I think
on the adult content.
Yes. Did we meet at some...
You were doing the Man on the Street stuff with it.
Yeah. Okay, good. So we have met in person. That's not, my memory isn't failing me. I remember meeting you and talking to you and liking you for a very short period of my life. But then I was like, maybe I didn't. Maybe that didn't happen.
No, it was about 15 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. So. Well, you have done a ton in your career, and I just wanted to talk about your thoughts on things and comedy and the world that we're in, because I thought getting to know you and talking to you would be an interesting discussion, and I'm always looking to have fun, entertaining discussions. I feel like people don't interview the writers nearly as much as they do like people on camera and performers, and I feel like that's an untapped pool for podcast guests.
Come on. We have interesting stories. And most of us did fail in our attempts to get in front of the camera.
So, but you didn't, like, you were a smart kid and good student and successful. Like, you had another career or probably a lot of different things that you could have done, but that you were doing well. And weren't you like in advertising? And then we're like, nah, I think I'll become a comedy writer or something like that.
I mean, I settled for advertising. I was an advertising writer in the record industry. For Sony Music for about 5 years, maybe a little longer than 5 years. But I would do like magazine ads, print ads, the occasional liner notes. I did liner notes for a Spin Doctors record that was not the really popular one. It was not the unsuccessful one that followed that. It was the unsuccessful one that followed that one. And I wrote liner notes for the band Sponge, the guys that did the song Molly, and
wow,
in a world of useless wreckage. I did liner notes for not that album, for the less successful follow-up, but it was mostly a job to kind of keep me afloat in comedy, because in those days in the record industry, they spent money like water, and I had my own office on the 30th floor of the Sony building at 550 Madison Avenue.
Wow.
And I was the alternative writer, and Pearl Jam decided at one point, we're not going to do any advertising. So every other alternative band kind of followed suit. So my whole job was basically typing out Pearl Jam, the new album, send to the art department. And then I would audition for commercials and stuff like that and do comedy at night.
Oh, that's fascinating. So, I mean, did you want to be a writer first, a performer first? What was your dream gig? What was your influence like? If there were a performer who had a career that you wanted when you were young, when you were just getting started, who were those people?
Oh, when I was young, I absolutely loved Monty Python's Flying Circus. And my dad was from England, and we would watch anything that was on TV that was English. And he started letting me watch that when I was 5 or 6 years old, whenever it first came on public TV in New York. And I remember watching it, and this anxiety would creep in about 20 minutes into it. And I was like, oh my God, the show's almost over. And that would really affect me. And my brother is 9 years older, and my sister was 8 years older, and they would watch Saturday Night Live because they were teenagers.
Right.
And I would just stay up with them and watch it like from the very first season. So there was a lot of like sketch comedy that I was really excited about. And even as a kid, I watched Carol Burnett, and I loved Benny Hill when Benny Hill came on. And I watched some Benny Hill about 6 months ago on YouTube. Does not hold up.
No.
For a variety of reasons.
I mean, one would be like there'd be a political incorrectness, or...
Yeah, and also the fact that you realize he had about 7 or 8 jokes that he would cycle through over and over and over again.
Oh.
But yeah, it's mostly him chasing women and grabbing their bottoms. And but yeah, I really wanted to be a sketch comedy performer. And I did a lot of sketch in New York in the 90s. And it became clear to me that I was in a sketch troupe with Andy Daly.
Yeah, I know Andy Daly. Yeah,
working with Andy, I'd see like, oh, I can't do that. He's much better than me at that.
Right.
And, I booked a couple of commercials and did things like that. But then, I started doing stand-up, and I did that for a couple of years. But, the stuff I would do in my stand-up act was always topical. So when it came time to, put together a set for anything important, I didn't really have anything to do. And so Alex Sulkin, who's now my boss at Family Guy, at the time was a PA at SNL.
No way.
And he gave me the fax number for Weekend Update when Colin Quinn was hosting it. And Colin began to buy jokes for me. And I'd never met Colin. We would just kind of trade voicemails. And then Jon Stewart started at The Daily Show, and he wasn't a big fan of the Kilborn writers, and they were not of him either. And he asked Colin if he knew of anyone new, and Colin gave him my name.
Oh, wow.
And again, without ever having met me. And then I was John's first hire at The Daily Show. And I still continue doing stand-up at night. But I remember one time auditioning for Aspen, and I went up at the, what was the club that Lucian used to?
The comic strip.
Yeah, the comic strip. And I went up there, and like usual, I went over very well with the comedians in the room. And the crowd there they were polite. I got a lot of loud smiles. And, but, you know, when I got off stage, I had a conference call with Lou Viola the following day, like whoever was booking people for Aspen.
Yeah, that's right. Wow.
He and the other people are like, look, you should really work on your persona. And, you know, I was like, should I wear a hat or something? I'm not, you know, my comedy was never a confessional, like, here's another thing for my life.
Right.
So I kept kicking around stand up. And then a year later, I was asked to audition for Aspen again. And then I realized, like, you know, I did nothing that you people told me to do, you know, in terms of what I needed to work on with my act. So I declined the Aspen audition, and then I realized, like, you know, maybe performing is something you'll do if it falls in your lap. And like, I've had some acting roles over the last 10 or 15 years, but they've always been something where I've known the writer, or I've known the director.
Right. Or
like I was on an episode of Parks and Recreation, and I'm pretty sure the actor that they had booked had hurt himself or something, because Dan Gore, who is a writer on the show, who created Brooklyn Nine-Nine, he was directing his first episode. And he called me, I think, on a Saturday and said, hey, can you help me out with my episode? And I said, oh, okay, sure. And I thought it was like going to be a punch-up thing. And then like Wardrobe called me and said, you know, show up Monday morning. I'm like, oh, I'm acting in this.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But, you know, whenever I was a stand-up, the big compliment I would get from the industry was, you're a great writer.
Right.
It was never, you know, which is always the stop performing, go right for really talented people, knock it off.
Well, I mean, I think that's certainly a way of looking at it. But no one's ever said to me after I get off stage, "Oh, you're a great writer." So, like, there's performance, there's writing, there's people who put them all together really well. But I mean, so you know, the interesting question to ask out of that, I think, is that you were writing for yourself for the first part of your career. It's certainly the way most people start, but you have now written for a list of people who everybody knows. Everybody knows this list of people. Obviously, starting with Jon Stewart, and now you're at the Family Guy. But I mean, the list is long. Spike Fairstein. I'm just thinking of like some of the most respected. George Lopez, right? Anthony Jeselnik, and of course Bill Shatner. What did you do with Bill Shatner? Oh, yeah. That's like the tweet that made me say, I got to talk to Chris. I got to talk to him. I need to talk to him. You know, and then I was like, and I'll record it.
You know, that was such a great experience. I had worked on Lopez Tonight for a year, which was not a good experience. And I quit it without another job to go to.
Have you talked about that? Do you want to talk about why it wasn't a good experience? Or is that not, do you leave that on set?
Variety of reasons, ranging from him to the people who were running the show.
He was not good to you?
He barely spoke to me. Oh, but yeah, it was the people running the show were from a company called Telepictures, who run Ellen's show, and they're not real straight shooters. They're kind of tough to work for. And all the people that were running this late show are from the daytime world. And you know, there were some decent writers on there. And we would pitch them stuff, and they would come back with, why don't we do a cooking segment with George? Or, you know, why don't we have a Girl Scout on who made a brave 911 call? You know, it was all these daytime things.
Yeah.
And at one point, the executive producer said to us, we need new material every night. There are no refillables in late night. And we were all like, oh, like a top 10 list or jaywalking, you know. And so we were doing a new show from the ground up every night with a guy who was not interested in doing a new show every night. And it was, and you know, as soon as like not every Hispanic person in the country watched the show, the network kind of was like, just
right. They thought they were going to fill that demo, but they failed.
Yeah. They never quite did. And then at one point they just cut like everything Hispanic out of the show. It was this weird,
really
Yeah. You know, it was funny. My ex-wife came to a taping once because Morrissey was on.
Okay. Is that why you guys are not together anymore?
Yeah. Well, we were together then. Okay. And Lopez Tonight was not the reason we're not together. But my ex-wife is from Illinois. blonde-haired, blue-eyed, attractive woman. And they had a shot of her clapping for Morrissey. And a couple of weeks later, a crew member was, hey, your wife was in the show again. And I was like, no. And they were getting B-roll footage of white people clapping, and they would drop it into later episodes just to make the whole thing seem less Hispanic.
Your wife just kept appearing in the audience.
Yeah. She made another appearance, even though she wasn't there. But so that was such a, it's always tough to get a show off the ground.
Yeah.
And there were talented people working there. And I think under the right circumstances, it would have been a good thing for George. But the people running the show were not.
It's always weird to me.
Fit.
I want to get back to Shatner, but it is always weird to me when the host of a show, and you've worked with so many, are not really super friendly with everybody on the staff for the same reason a quarterback should be friendly as hell to the offensive lineman. Like, it works for you. It's good for you to be. And I get it that not everybody's a dick. Some people are socially awkward or standoffish or they don't know how to. But I just really, and I've worked with a lot of guys too, and I just really I've never really understood it, especially if you're a writer. I mean, it's one thing if you're like a researcher or a lowly of some sort, which is still weird to me. But what do you think about that and your experience? Who's been good? I'm not going to ask you to trash a bunch of people, but
it's very, very odd. Like, he didn't pick me. There was a very weird selection process. Like, he had some writers that he brought in, and then there were other people that the network brought in. That's always a very weird, non-organic way to do things. So, but because we didn't have a history and because there was never a meeting, I just suddenly showed up at work. I think that created a weird dynamic. And again, I think it was a bunch of people from the daytime world that didn't realize the kind of hunker down camaraderie you need in a late night show because, it's a real grind.
Right.
So we were all just kind of strangers, sort of working for a guy. And it was a very big corporate, like we had a massive staff, and not necessarily one I think we needed for the amount of content we were putting out. But yeah, there are so many comedians who are very good at least talking the talk and like, you're my buddy. Hey buddy, how's it going?
At least.
But that was very, it was made clear that we didn't have tremendous access to him, and that it was an experience unlike I ever had. And I don't know if that came from him. I think that may have come from the bosses, but we all had to like basically schedule an appointment to get in to talk with him about material, which was very, very odd. And, Jon Stewart never let anything on the air that he wasn't, fully aware of and stuff that he had input in. But, and Spike Ferriston was, came from a writing background, so he wanted in. But yeah, like, I think, George is a very busy guy on the road. And I think he has quite a few passions outside of doing a late night talk show, which is, really tough work.
Yeah.
And
what are some of those passions, would you say?
Well, I mean, doing road gigs. He is a big fan of golf. I did a shoot one time with him and Oscar De La Hoya where we were following them around for 18 holes of golf in Las Vegas. And me and the producer went there just loaded for bear with gags. And it became very clear that neither George or Oscar De La Hoya wanted their golf game interrupted with comedy. So I was essentially a caddy with a binder full of gags. And, hey, can we get this one in now? Like, nope. We'll get it in on the 18th hole.
Oh,
and
that's fun.
It was then I learned that golf is the most exhausting, just hauling around for 18 holes. But, yeah, he's a very busy guy. He plays very big rooms and travels around. So I think that's where, a lot of the money came in. I remember I worked with Frank Caliendo on a sketch show, and, Frank was sort of saying that doing this TV show was a pay cut because it was cutting into his, into the college gigs and the big, huge, stadiums he does.
Yeah. So, that's also never a great attitude to have as well, because I always thought about my career as, when I get offered gigs that were too low or were not worth it to me at the time, I'd always tell whoever's offering, like, listen, I can't right now, but on the way down, 100% I'm going to need that. So I don't mean to be a jerk. It's just that, like, I'm doing like all this. Whatever. How did you leave? Like, just back to the Shatner thing, like you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I quit Lopez because I realized it wasn't good for me, and I wasn't going to be the writer they wanted me to be there. And I was actually thinking of just maybe leaving showbiz, because I'd left the Daily Show in 2006, and I'd won Emmys and stuff like that there. And my career had just, when I came to LA, had just been kind of one stumble after another, like just on one show that got canceled, another show that got canceled. And I was really thinking, like, maybe there's something else I can do. And my book agent called me out of the blue. And I was in Santa Monica unemployed grabbing coffee. And he said, look, this is a ghostwriting gig. You probably won't want it. But I thought, maybe you'd want to take the meeting. I'm like, oh, who? With who? He's like, it's with William Shatner. I'm like, well, of course I'm going to take the meeting with William Shatner. And I went up there, and it was for a humor book that was called Shatner Rules. And an editor at a publishing house had read a New York Times Magazine interview with him and thought he was a real character. And
you went up there. Did you go to his house? I
went to his office.
Okay.
On Ventura Boulevard. It was so funny because to this day, I always arrive everywhere early in Los Angeles because I'm never sure, like it's a New Yorker in me. I don't ever want to be late.
Yeah.
And so I got there about 15 minutes early, and I parked, and I kind of walked by his office, and then I realized I was staring at Shatner because he has this big window that faces right out on a very busy boulevard. And he was there at his desk reading some kind of horse riding magazine because that's his real passion in life. So I'm like, oh, I better stop staring at William Shatner and go walk around the block a couple of times, which I did. And then I eventually went in there, and he and I just really, really hit it off from the get-go.
Yeah.
And all sorts of people warned me about him. I know people in comedy who've worked with him and kind of talk about him being a bit of a prickly pear. And he is, but I think if you're not performing with him, if you're writing with him, it's like if you're not an actor, you can approach him from a lot of different ways. Like if you're an actor doing a scene with him, I can see where he'd be a bit of a challenge. He's very passionate about what he does, and he's very headstrong about things. But this was a book we had to turn around very quickly. We needed 50,000 words. I needed to get about 50,000 words out of it in maybe 3.5 months. So I interviewed him a total of about 24 hours, and I would try to track him down and, like, hey, is Bill free to talk this week about the book? And his assistant would say, well, he's at Dragon Con in Perth, Australia for a couple of days, so I would get with him and just record him for hours at a time. And his mind kind of goes in a million different directions at once.
Yeah.
He's really an interesting guy. And, it's a bit like herding cats trying to,
Sure. Yeah. He came in to do the show, my old show, and he walked in performing, which a lot of guys do, which was always appealing to me because I was like, oh, they're already on, which is great because we are on the air. Yeah. And there was always a test, like, I'm going to do this improv and I'm going to find out real quick if you're going to do it with me or if you're going to want to do a different interview, and I'll go, But as soon as he came in, he was dancing. And I recognized it right away. And he came in, he goes, is the mic on? Yeah. And he goes, I was on The View today and my fly was wide open. And I was like, okay, well, here we are. This is what we're going to do. Like, we're going to improv. And I really enjoyed it. It was my only time ever talking to him, but it was great. It was great. He was totally on and a pro. He's old as hell too. And you wouldn't know it.
He loves talking philosophy. He loves talking comedy. He loves talking comedy theory. Because I remember I wrote something and I gave him a sample chapter, and he's like, I come across as an ass. You're making me look like a silly ass. And I began to try to sell him about like how vulnerability is important in comedy. Like, you can't be the coolest guy in the room,
right?
At all the time.
That's hard for TJ Hooker and Captain Kirk.
Well, yeah. Yeah, but in comedy, we need to bring you down to earth a bit,
right?
Make you a little bit more life size, and he totally got it. He really was unlike any sort of fella I've ever met. Like, obviously, wanted to be a Shakespearean actor from the time he was very young. He's very passionate about it. He's aware that a lot of people have fun with him. But I used to too. I was like, oh, you Shatner, silly guy, Captain Kirk beat me up, blah, blah, blah. But after having spent, 4 intensive months working with him and writing a book, I really walked away with a tremendous respect for the guy. And I also think he's a very good actor. And I think there are, particularly in recent years, he's done some performances on TV that are really, really strong and solid.
I agree. I could talk to you forever about these people that you've worked with and your thoughts on it, but I want to ask you I just want to get your thoughts on the world. I mean, you started as you said earlier, someone writing about, topical jokes. And of course, you won all the awards at the greatest show ever, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. And you continue to obviously comment on the world as it is, as you see it. And I'm so there for it. I love following you on Twitter. And obviously, you're writing on all these big TV shows. And whether people know it's Chris Regan or not, there's a reason that you're there. So, Chris Regan, what do you think about, like, how do you think about the world and where we're at? Like, are you an optimist, a pessimist, a realist? How do you see where America right now is at in terms of democracy? I'll refine my question.
I think I'm a realist, and it's impossible not to be a pessimist now about that, because I've never in my 54 years seen an America like the one I'm seeing now. I would really like to sit down with teenage me and tell them what a real fascist is, because, boy, I loved calling Reagan one, when I was 16 or 17 years old, and I had no idea. But this is absolutely nuts what's going on in this country. And, I think I wrote on Twitter something about, for creeping fascism, this is occurring very, very quickly.
Yeah.
It's just such an odd thing. And it's strange in that, we were supposed to be saved by information and the computer age and the internet, and it was going to be this great tool for education, but it has just warped so many people's worldview. And there's so many communities out there fueled by loneliness and anger and hate. And I mean, the QAnon thing, I cannot believe that there are so many folk that are on board with this. And
do you know anybody do you know personally anybody that is a QAnon person in your life?
If they are now, I got rid of them on Facebook. They were high school friends, because
right.
There were friends from high school who, were conservative or whatever. And, they would post stuff during the Bush years, like, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But when Trump came along, that's when they started posting photos of Obama with a bone through his nose and birth certificate and all this other business. Yeah. And then I was like, I don't want any kind of connection to these people, virtual or otherwise. And, but yeah, and since COVID, I've had to get rid of a couple of anti-vaxxers. And, it's just, everyone's finding their own echo chamber to back up their own certain set of beliefs. And it's just so bananas to me. I hate to sound like an old man. And, I've always tried, I grew up in kind of a hippie town, New Paltz, New York. Yep. A lot of my teachers went to Woodstock and stuff like that. And there was always this sort of baby boomer derision of us Gen Xers, always kind of criticizing our music and stuff. And I always swore going forth I would never be that old guy scratching his head. I don't get it, but there's a lot I don't get right now.
Yeah, but you're not necessarily saying that you don't get the younger generation and why they're doing what they're doing. You're saying I don't get my own peers. That's what I'm hearing you say. I don't understand why people are believing things that aren't true and are believing things that aren't. And, it's two different realities, it would seem. It doesn't seem to me to be so cut and dried political, liberal or conservative. It's I now ask people listen, who do you think won the election? And do you believe COVID's real and vaccines work? And then I go from there. That's how I analyze folks now.
There's a guy I went to college with, and we went to the same college. We studied the same stuff. And I caught up with some YouTube clips he was posting of himself. And, I would watch him occasionally because he was sort of a character. But over the past year, it just went from I'm a libertarian to suddenly I'm for Trump, and to suddenly I'm not getting the vaccine because blah, blah, blah. And talking about red pills and white pills and all this other business. And it's just completely overwhelmed him. That basically everything is Biden is doing this because of X, Y, Z. And it's big pharma. And, there are just all these others. But, in terms of the younger generation, a lot of people have nothing but derision for millennials or Gen Zers or whatever. I honestly have nothing but empathy for them. There's this woman I talk to occasionally at the dog park who's 27 years old. She's half my age. And I was kind of lamenting, Yeah, I'm thinking of moving back to New York and getting a place and, a piece of property kind of high up, away from trees, just thinking about, environmental devastation and a place to kind of sit back and watch the end of the world. And she's like, she said to me, you're lucky because you're going to die before it gets really bad. Whereas someone like me, when I'm your age, and it was strange to sort of have things put in perspective, like, I've got maybe 30 years left, on the, if I look at my family history, I'm conceivably, I could be entering my last decade, but I don't think I'm going to get that old. But there are people who I know who are very young who have, more of this crap to deal with than I'm going to have to deal with. And, it's funny. I started out saying I was a realist. I think I am a pessimist, but it's been very hard to be optimistic over things over the last couple of years. Someone pointed out yesterday on Twitter, talking about Joe Manchin's resistance to the various fossil fuel stuff in the bill. And it appeared in the 10th paragraph of this article where someone was saying most people look at this provision as the last ditch attempt to save the earth from environmental catastrophe. And it's so weird that was buried in this article. And, there was the first couple of paragraphs were about the Punch and Judy show that politics have become, this sort of fun little spectator sport that people are in, and burying the fact that, it's 10 minutes to midnight or whatever.
What do you, last question for you, Chris, I could just keep talking to you, but what do you think about the role of media, however you define media? I feel like you can't talk about it without being very specific. Cable news versus Twitter versus Facebook. I mean, or you can lump them all together. You could say the corporate media, independent media, YouTube, podcasts, whatever. But in terms of, who does a good job, who do you trust? And who do you think is faking it, phoning it in, or sensational, whatever you want to say?
I read the New York Times and I read the Washington Post, and I look at them occasionally. My friend Julia Sharp pointed out to me that no one really needs to check the news more than 2 or 3 times a day. And we look back, and it's still a living memory for me of walking to work in the morning and picking up the newspaper. Yeah. And kind of getting the fill of what was going on in the world. I used to get the Daily News in the New York Times, and I would walk up to the Daily Show and just work from there. But there's such an onslaught of information now, and I don't know if anybody is necessarily getting the right message out there. Take Fox News off the table. It's ridiculous. But CNN and NBC have 24 hours to do some really insightful, probing look at the news, but it's not. It's like, I know people, I guess politically I'm most aligned with MSNBC, but if I sit down and watch, I'm like, oh, geez, this again? Are you like, we're going to talk about this one dumb thing all day long? Yeah. I would love if some of these networks put like a 2-hour-long show together, not about the 80s or, like whatever, or, the history of stand-up or something like that CNN is always doing in long form, and just kind of talk about, how we got where we are. And,
my favorite MSNBC now is my friend Ali Velshi on the weekends. You ever watch his weekend show? It's so good. He does deep dives with policy experts, and then he travels around the country and interviews actual people that are being caught up in any of these issues, and it's, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of, I just bring it up because it's kind of what you said. It's like 2 hours Saturday and Sunday. And I don't know what the ratings are or, what matters at this point, but it's really good. It reminds me of a lot of PBS stuff. But
I mean, I'll definitely check it out. I used to love the McNeil Lehrer News Hour. That became the News Hour. But I think there's just such an influx of opinion that we're just drowning in it. And I sometimes think about going back to the Daily Show, that because we were kind of the only kid on the block doing that sort of thing at one time, and like, what was our responsibility in that? Because we did a solid 8 years of Republicans are idiots, not necessarily with a lot of nuance. And I sometimes think, those of us in comedy kind of beat that over the head so thoroughly that people just put their dukes up and stop listening. And it all became about owning the libs, at one point. And, all moderation has kind of gone by the wayside now. You're either for us or against us. And I could say even further back, adding comment sections on any articles, I think has been bad for us as a society. at one point I could have a stupid idea and have no validation for it anywhere. It would be my stupid idea rattling around my own head. And then I'd be, distracted by having to go grocery shopping now. But now you can get a dumb idea out there. It can affect somebody else and go on and on and on. And it makes me unplugged. But, I'm addicted to Twitter. And, as a guy who is in late night, I kind of need that joke fix, because when I worked in late night, you could write a joke and then that night would be on like, oh, it worked or not. Now that I work in half hour, it takes about a year to see if anything works. So, well,
I love your Twitter feed and I hope everybody listening follows it. And I also love that you did this like yesterday, a picture in this case of the guy with the AK, the AR-15 at like a Starbucks. Yeah. And you kept tweeting it with different jokes. And I love that. I love when anybody does that and not enough people do it. It's like, which one do I do? They keep doing them. I'm there for it. And I just want you to know I will continue to carry that torch. I love your tweets, especially. All of it. Man. It's great. I'm glad that you're doing it because
I really appreciate it. Yeah, and, it's been so lucrative that I'm not going to I'm not going to quit anytime soon.
I'm sure. Well, keep it up. Keep up the good work. And I really appreciate it's great to reconnect with you. And I'd keep talking to you, but I know you have an actual job that you got to get to. So thank you so much for joining me, Chris. Let's do it again.
I appreciate it. Take care, Pete.
Stand up. Yeah, Chris Regan. That was real cool. On Twitter at Chris R. Regan. And that was nice. I could tell that he enjoyed doing it. And I was really happy to have him. Super impressed with his amazing career, and he's got a great reputation. And so I'm sorry I didn't get to talk to him more or at all really about the Family Guy, but we'll get him back on and maybe he'll hang out with us one night and we could have him telling stories. It'd be real fun. I should just been thinking about doing more thoughtful, lighthearted segments about people's lives and careers and just distract you and expand your mind a little bit and cheer you up with all the things going on in the world and your world. And just thought Chris Regan and other comedy writers would be a good idea to have on. So more of that. You got ideas for who you want me to interview? I can usually do a pretty good job getting to know them, welcome them into our conversation, make them feel comfortable here with the stand-up community. So always let me know. standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, well, sorry there was no news today, but I did raise a lot of money for an anti-poverty organization with Why Hunger. If you want to donate, by the way, whyhunger.org/donate to that organization. Also, go get your electric toothbrush thanks to my sponsor, Quip. Go getquip.com/standup. Getquip.com/standup, QUIP. By the way, in case, go get your smart electric toothbrush for adults and kids. Do that now. Help your mouth and the show continue, because I can't do it without you. Sign up for a subscription if you haven't already. Thank you so much for listening from start to finish. Those of you who do, you're going to get a very special thank you from me someday in person. When is that going to be? I hope soon. All right, I love you guys. I'm going to stop talking now. But I'll talk to you again tomorrow right here on Stand Up. John Carroll, please take us out right now. Let's stand up.
No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. Seize the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw the land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see them flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be closed up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up. Oh, got to stand up. Ooh, come on, just stand up. Everybody got to stand up in the darkest hour. Stand up, people got the power. Stand up. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.